Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be sent away, not for love, but as a joke, to be told you're too plain, too quiet, too unworthy, and then be shipped across 1,000 miles of dust and wilderness just to get you out of sight? That's what happened to Margaret Whitmore, the so-called ugly daughter from St. Louis. Her own family sent her west under false pretenses, a cruel trick meant to humiliate her. But fate, as it often does on the frontier, had other plans. When she stepped off that train in the middle of nowhere, she was meant to be a punchline. Instead, she met Elias Monroe, a widowed rancher with a wounded heart, and a little girl who hadn't laughed in months. And there, amid the wide Wyoming sky and the dust of 1,000 broken dreams, Maggie faced the hardest question of all. Would she let the world define her worth, or would she build a new one with her own hands? If you were her, if your whole life had told you that you weren't enough, what would you do when love quietly knocked on your door? This is a story about second chances, quiet courage, and the kind of love that doesn't come with fireworks, but with the warmth of a fire on a cold night. So settle in, friends. Let's ride back to the frontier where hearts were tested, souls were mended, and one ugly daughter became the most beautiful story ever told. If this kind of story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts, where love always finds its way. No matter how wild the road, the Whitmore house stood like a relic of a better time. 3 stories of fate and glory on the edge of St. Louis. Chandeliers still glittered above the long dining table, but the gold on the walls had dulled, and the laughter that once filled the halls had turned brittle. At the head of the table sat Charlotte Whitmore, elegant and cold as a porcelain doll. Beside her, Clarissa, the younger daughter, was all ribbons and charm, the kind of beauty that made men forget reason. And at the far end, half hidden in the candlelight, sat Margaret, known to her family as Maggie the eldest, the quiet one. Her dress was plain, her hands a little rough from helping the servants, her gaze steady and calm. Charlotte tapped her glass with a silver fork. "We've received a rather curious letter," she said. "A proposal from a certain Mr. Elias Monroe, a cattle rancher in the Wyoming territory. He seeks a wife, sight unseen." Clarissa giggled, covering her lips with her gloved hand. Sight unseen. He must be desperate. Charlotte's eyes gleamed. Desperate and wealthy. He has hundreds of acres, a fine herd, and no wife since the cholera took his. He's written to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis, and by some coincidence, his letter found its way to me. Across the table, Maggie looked up. "Why you?" Mother Charlotte ignored the question. "He asked for a woman of good family, moral standing, and strong constitution. Someone who could bear the hardships of the West." Clarissa laughed again. "Oh, that sounds dreadful. Dust, horses, sweat. Certainly not for me." Charlotte smiled a smile sharp as glass. "No, darling, not for you, but perhaps for your sister." The words fell like stones. Maggie sat still, though her heart clenched. For me, she asked quietly. Charlotte sipped her wine. "You're 27, Margaret, no suitors, no dowry worth mentioning. A woman past her bloom has few options, but perhaps a rancher would find use for a sensible wife." Clarissa burst into laughter. "Oh, Mama, that's wicked. Send Maggie West as a mail-order bride. Imagine his face when he sees her." The laughter echoed off the walls. Maggie set down her fork and folded her hands. Her voice was soft. "You mean to send me as a joke?" Charlotte didn't flinch. "Don't be dramatic. You'll have a roof, food, a husband, perhaps even gratitude. Some women are not meant for city life." Silence filled the room. The ticking of the clock grew louder. Maggie's face remained composed, though her throat burned. Inside, she thought of her late father, of how he once told her she had her grandmother's courage. She remembered tending his fever, the only one who stayed by his bedside till his last breath. But courage meant little in this house of mirrors. Clarissa toyed with her pearl necklace. "You'll send him my picture, won't you?" "Mama, let's see how long it takes him to realize the difference." Charlotte smiled thinly. "A harmless deception. He'll be too far to make a fuss." Maggie stood up slowly. The chair scraped against the floor. "If I refuse," Charlotte's eyes narrowed, "then you'll remain here, dependent on my charity. And when this house is sold, and it will be, you'll have nowhere to go." Clarissa sighed dramatically. "Oh, Maggie, don't be stubborn. Maybe he'll even like you. Ranchers are strange creatures." Maggie turned to the window. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the glass. The city lights shimmered in the distance like false promises. She could stay and rot in this house of cruelty or leave and face whatever waited beyond the plains. When she turned back, her expression was unreadable. "Fine," she said quietly. "Send me." Charlotte blinked, surprised by the calm in her voice. "You'll go willingly, I will," Maggie said. "You've wanted me gone for years. Consider your wish granted." Clarissa clapped her hands. "Oh, how marvelous the ugly duckling flies west." Maggie gathered her napkin, placed it neatly beside her plate, and met Charlotte's eyes. "Mother, I hope someday you realize what kind of cruelty you've sown tonight." Charlotte's smile faltered, just for a second. "Cruelty. Dear, I'm giving you purpose." Maggie turned and left the room without another word. The air behind her felt colder. Upstairs, she sat by her small desk, the letter lying open before her. "Mr. Elias Monroe," she whispered, tracing the name. The handwriting was strong, deliberate. He had written of a quiet ranch surrounded by red hills, of his daughter, Addie, who needed a mother's care, of his wish for a woman who valued honesty over vanity. Her heart ached. If only he knew. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her small leather satchel. The next morning, she would take the early train west. There was nothing left here but shadows. In the mirror, she caught her reflection, pale skin, tired eyes, a strand of dark hair falling over her face. Not beautiful, not remarkable, but beneath that, something steady. "I may be their joke," she whispered, "but I'll be no one's fool." Downstairs, the clock struck 10. Somewhere in the dark, a carriage rattled past, hooves striking cobblestone like a heartbeat fading away. Maggie blew out her candle, her mind already far beyond the city, toward a horizon she had never seen. Out there, perhaps, she thought, a woman could build a life not chosen for her, but by her own hands. The morning Maggie left St. Louis, the sky hung low and gray, heavy with drizzle. The cobblestones outside the station gleamed like dull silver, and the whistle of the departing trains carried a lonely kind of music. She stood on the wooden platform, her gloved hands clutching a small carpet bag and a satchel of letters. Her entire life fit into 2 modest pieces of luggage. No one came to see her off. Charlotte had claimed a headache. Clarissa was attending a luncheon. The butler had placed her trunk in the coach without meeting her eyes. It was strange, Maggie thought, how quiet cruelty could be. It didn't always shout, it could also look away. The conductor called, "All aboard for Kansas City, Topeka, and points west." The words rang through the cold air. Maggie stepped up onto the train. Inside, the air was thick with coal smoke and humanity soldiers returning west, mothers with infants, men in dusty coats, a salesman with a traveling trunk. She found a seat near the back, beside a window streaked with rain. When the train lurched forward, the rhythm of the wheels against the rails sounded like a heartbeat, steady, determined, unstoppable. The city blurred past the red brick factories, the horse-drawn carriages, the spires of St. Louis fading into mist. She pressed a hand against the glass. For the first time in her life, she was leaving without permission. Hours passed. The train roared through Missouri farmland, past fields half asleep from winter. The passengers settled into uneasy peace. A young mother across the aisle struggled with her crying baby. Maggie offered a handkerchief, then gently rocked the infant while the woman dozed. Her movements were practiced, instinctive. Years of tending others had trained her hands to kindness. The baby's soft breathing eased into sleep. The young mother stirred. "Thank you, ma'am," she whispered. "I didn't catch your name." "Maggie," she said simply. Going far, Maggie smiled faintly. "Farther than I've ever gone." The woman nodded, her eyes kind. Sometimes the Lord moves us where we need to be. That night, the passengers dozed as the train clattered through Kansas. Maggie couldn't sleep. The scent of smoke and iron filled her lungs. She opened her satchel and unfolded the letter from Elias Monroe again. His words were plain. Honest, no flourishes, no promises of romance. He had written, "I seek a wife not for vanity, but for steadiness. I've a little girl who needs a mother's heart, and a home that needs a woman's hand. If you are willing to build, not dream, I will meet you halfway." Maggie read the line 3 times. "Build, not dream," she murmured. "I can build." Her mind drifted to the faces she'd left behind. Charlotte's cold smile, Clarissa's laughter, the servants who never dared speak. For a brief moment, she felt a pang of grief not for them, but for the version of herself who had tried for so long to be enough in that house. The train rattled through the dark plains. Beyond the window stretched miles of moonlit fields and empty sky. Maggie whispered to herself, "Perhaps, out there, the world will finally be wide enough." The next day, the train stopped in a small town for water. Maggie stepped out to stretch her legs. A tall man with a scar on his cheek was unloading crates. He nodded to her politely. "You headin' farther west, ma'am, I am," she replied. He smiled. "They say out there the wind never stops and the stars never end. You best keep your heart steady. Miss, the plains test everyone. I imagine they do," she said. When the train pulled away again, she noticed the land changing. Trees thinned, the sky seemed to grow larger, the air turned sharper, cleaner. Each mile stripped away a layer of the world she'd known. At a whistle stop near Dodge City, a man in a bowler hat boarded the car and took the seat beside her. He was curious, talkative, traveling alone, brave thing for a lady, going to meet someone. Perhaps Maggie hesitated. Yes, a rancher. The man raised a brow. Mail order. Then her cheeks flushed. She didn't answer. He chuckled softly. "No shame in it. Miss, out here, everyone's looking for a new start." The trick is to keep your heart your own. When he got off 3 towns later, Maggie felt oddly lighter. By the 3rd day, the landscape had turned wild. Jagged hills, long sweeps of prairie grass, rivers that cut through the earth like silver threads. At night, when the train stopped at small depots, coyotes howled in the distance. The passengers grew quiet, humbled by the immensity of it all. Maggie sat wrapped in her shawl, staring at the stars. They looked close enough to touch. She thought about the man waiting at the other end, Elias Monroe. In her imagination, he was neither handsome nor fearsome, but solid, like the land itself. She wondered what he'd think when he saw her. Would he be angry, disappointed, pity her? A small fear flickered in her chest, but she pushed it down. No one can send me anywhere again, she told herself. This time, I chose. On the 4th night, a storm rolled in. Lightning tore across the sky. The train slowed to a crawl, the wind screaming against the cars. Passengers stirred, frightened. A child began to cry. Maggie moved to help, holding the little one close until the worst passed. When dawn broke, the world outside was covered in white. The conductor shouted that a snowdrift had blocked the tracks ahead. They'd be delayed several hours. Maggie stepped outside into the frozen air. Snow glittered like glass under the sun. She walked a few steps from the train, breathing deeply. It was the first time she'd felt truly clean in years. A soldier offered her coffee from a tin cup. "You headin' for the territory, ma'am?" "Yes, Copper Valley." He grinned. "God bless you. Folks say the wind up there can skin a man alive." She smiled faintly. "Then I'll keep my back to it." As the train finally pushed forward, Maggie returned to her seat, her boots damp, her cheeks flushed from the cold. The landscape outside grew wilder. No more towns, only the vast reach of Wyoming waiting. She closed her eyes and listened to the rhythm of the train. Each turn of the wheel carried her farther from ridicule, closer to a life she couldn't yet imagine. In her dreams, she saw the outline of red hills, a wooden house standing alone against the wind, and a small girl with braids waving from a porch. She didn't know yet that the image would soon become her life. When the whistle blew for the final stop, Maggie opened her eyes. Copper Valley Station, the end of the line. She gathered her belongings and stepped into the bitter wind. The station was little more than a wooden platform and a telegraph shack. A single wagon waited by the fence. Beside it stood a tall man in a long coat, his hat pulled low, his shoulders broad. His breath rose in small clouds against the cold. And beside him, a little girl in a red scarf kicked at the snow, humming softly to herself. Maggie's gloved hand tightened around her satchel. Her heart pounded. The man lifted his head, eyes searching the arriving passenger. When his gaze met hers, he froze. For a moment, neither moved. The world seemed to hold its breath between them. And that was how Margaret Whitmore met Elias Monroe on a cold morning at the edge of the world. Both of them standing where their old lives ended and something entirely new was about to begin. The wind at Copper Valley Station cut straight through wool and bone. It carried the scent of iron, horses, and snow. Maggie stepped off the train, boots crunching on the frozen platform, her small carpet bag clutched tight against her chest. For a moment, she stood still, letting the wind sting her face. The wide sky stretched endlessly, pale blue and merciless. She had never seen a sky so large. Back in St. Louis, buildings pressed close, hemming her in. Here, the horizon itself looked like freedom and danger all at once. A tall man waited beside a wagon hitched to two bays. His coat was dusted with snow, his hat pulled low, and the shadow of his beard caught the morning light. When his eyes found her, his jaw tightened ever so slightly. Miss Clarissa Whitmore. His voice was deep, polite but cautious. Maggie's throat went dry. She hesitated, then spoke. "I'm Margaret Whitmore. My sister could not make the journey." He frowned. "Margaret, I see." Behind him, the little girl in the red scarf peeked out from behind her father's coat, eyes wide with curiosity. She was all freckles and windburn, a small bundle of color in the pale morning. Maggie bent slightly, offering a gentle smile. "And you must be Addie." The girl nodded shyly, then whispered, "Papa said you'd be prettier." Elias's face darkened. "Addie," but Maggie only smiled, soft and unoffended. "He might have been right," she said lightly, "but I promise I'm kind." The child studied her for a long moment, then took a hesitant step forward. "You look kind," she said finally, as if confirming something for herself. Maggie knelt in the snow. "That's good enough for me." When she stood again, Elias was still watching her, careful, reserved, as though trying to decide what sort of woman had arrived in place of the one he'd expected. He offered his hand. "The ranch is 5 miles north. If you're tired, we can stop halfway at the creek for a rest." "I'm fine," she said, though her fingers were already numb from the cold. He helped her climb into the wagon. The bench was rough but clean, a thick blanket laid across it. Addie nestled between them, humming softly to herself as the horses started forward. For a long stretch, no one spoke. The wagon wheels creaked over the frozen ground. Maggie kept her hands clasped in her lap, feeling the tension sitting between them like a wall. She could sense Elias's discomfort, the disappointment he didn't dare voice, the unspoken question hanging in the air. "Who are you, and why are you here?" "Finally," he said, "I received a letter from your mother, my stepmother," she corrected gently. He nodded once. "She said you were eager to start a new life." "That part's true," Maggie said, though perhaps not for the reason she gave. He glanced at her, his gray eyes unreadable. "I see." Addie looked up at Maggie. "Do you like horses? I've never been near one," Maggie admitted, "but I hope they'll like me." Addie giggled. "Papa says animals always know the truth about people." Elias gave a quiet snort. "That's because animals don't lie." Maggie smiled faintly. "Neither do I. Mr. Monroe." He didn't answer, but she thought she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, just slightly. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun had climbed higher, melting the thin crust of snow along the fence posts. The Monroe homestead came into view, a sturdy 2-story house built of pine, smoke rising from its chimney, surrounded by barns and open pasture. To Maggie, it looked less like a home and more like a kingdom of solitude. As they drew closer, a ranch hand waved from the barnyard. "Mornin'. Boss," he called. "Who's the lady, Miss Whitmore?" Elias replied simply. The man nodded politely, but raised his brows in curiosity. Maggie could feel the weight of their eyes on her, measuring, assessing, wondering what kind of Eastern woman had come all this way. Elias helped her down from the wagon. "You'll stay in the guest room upstairs for now," he said, "until we figure things out." "I appreciate that," she said softly. Inside, the house was simple but warm. The scent of wood smoke and bread filled the air. A fire burned in the hearth, and a patched quilt hung over the back of a rocking chair. Maggie's chest tightened. It wasn't fine or elegant like the Whitmore estate, but it felt alive. Elias set her bags by the stairs. "I'll show you the room." She followed him up the narrow staircase. The walls were lined with family photographs his late wife, she guessed, smiling beside him in front of the same house, a baby in her arms. Maggie looked away quickly. The guest room was modest, a small bed, a dresser, a window looking out over the rolling plains. Elias paused at the door. "You'll have privacy here. Supper's at 6. You'll hear the bell." "Thank you, Mr. Monroe." He hesitated. "Elias will do." When he left, Maggie sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled. The room was quiet, except for the faint whistle of wind through the eaves. She opened her small case and took out a folded photograph her father, years before he'd passed. His kind eyes stared back at her. "I'm here, Papa," she whispered, "and I'll be fine. Later." She found Addie in the kitchen, feeding scraps of bread to a barn cat curled near the stove. The girl looked up with a grin. "Papa says you can help me with my reading. I'm not very good." Maggie knelt beside her. "Then we'll learn together." Addie's grin widened. "Do you know any stories plenty?" Maggie said. "But you'll have to promise not to fall asleep halfway." The child giggled and nodded. Elias appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. "You're good with her," he said quietly. Maggie looked up. Children understand kindness. They always do. He studied her for a moment, then said, "I wasn't told you had a talent for nursing or teaching. I wasn't asked," she replied. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Elias nodded once and turned away. That night, after supper, Maggie stood outside on the porch. The stars hung enormous above her, sharp and bright against the black sky. The air smelled of pine and cold earth. Somewhere beyond the fence, a coyote howled. For the first time, she didn't feel trapped. The silence didn't frighten her, it steadied her. Inside, she heard Elias reading softly to Addie before bed. The low rumble of his voice carried through the walls, calm and strong. Maggie closed her eyes. Something in that sound, a simple father reading to his child, soothed the ache she hadn't realized was still there. She thought of Charlotte and Clarissa, of their laughter echoing in marble halls, and she thought of the quiet here, the honest kind of quiet that didn't demand or belittle. When she finally lay down in the small bed, exhaustion pulled her under. Her last thought before sleep was of the rancher's gray eyes and the little girl's red scarf. Maybe, she thought, this wasn't punishment at all. Maybe this was the beginning of something meant to be. Morning came with a thin veil of mist hanging over the valley. The ranch stirred awake slowly, like a great animal stretching after sleep. Chickens scratched the earth behind the barn. Horses snorted in the corral, and the scent of wood smoke drifted through the crisp air. Maggie rose before the sun, as she always had. The floorboards were cold beneath her feet, the air so quiet she could hear the faint hum of the wind through the window seams. She dressed in the plain brown dress she'd worn since arriving, pinned her hair back, and stepped downstairs. In the kitchen, the old iron stove glowed faintly. Addie was already there, sitting cross-legged on a stool, her red scarf hanging from a peg beside her. She looked up with a sleepy grin. "Papa says breakfast doesn't cook itself, but I think he's wrong. If we stare long enough, maybe it'll just happen." Maggie laughed softly. If only it worked that way. She rolled up her sleeves. Come on, little one, let's prove 'em right instead. They cooked side by side, Maggie showing Addie how to stir the batter for Johnny cakes, how to flip them without burning the edges. The child's laughter filled the room, and for the first time since arriving, Maggie felt something inside her ease a small, unexpected peace. Elias appeared in the doorway, coat already on, the morning sun catching in his hair. He paused, watching the two of them, his expression unreadable. "That smells better than anything we've had around here in a while," he said. Addie turned, proud. "I helped, I can tell." He replied, "Looks like you got a new cook. Miss Whitmore." Maggie set a plate on the table, just someone trying to earn her keep. Elias took his seat, nodding in quiet approval as Addie chattered about schoolwork and horses and the mysterious way pancakes always disappear too fast. The sound of their small, ordinary breakfast wrapped around Maggie like warmth she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Afterward, Elias saddled his horse for the day's work. Maggie followed him outside, tucking her shawl tighter against the wind. "Can I help?" she asked. He hesitated. "You don't have to." "I'd like to," she said simply. He studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the barn. "You can start with the feed. Just don't let the gray mare fool you, she bites." It was the first time he'd let her touch anything beyond the kitchen. The hours that followed were hard but good. Maggie shoveled hay, carried water, and bandaged a small cut on one of the horses when Elias was too busy to notice. The ranch hands watched her with quiet curiosity. She wasn't delicate like they'd expected her hands steady, her words polite but firm. By noon, her back ached and her gloves were filthy. Elias approached, holding out a tin cup of water. "You keep this up every day? You'll outwork half the men here." Maggie smiled, wiping sweat from her brow. "I'll take that as a compliment. It was meant as one." His tone softened. "You learn fast?" "I've had to," she said. "Life doesn't often wait for permission." He looked at her then, really looked, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. Respect, perhaps, or a quiet recognition of shared endurance. But before either could say more, Addie came running from the house, waving a small slate board. "Papa, Miss Maggie, look. I did my sums right." Elias chuckled, reaching for her. "You sure did, sweetheart." Maggie smiled, watching them together, the picture of father and daughter, framed by the barn's doorway, tugged at something deep inside her, a longing she hadn't known how to name. That evening, the wind picked up. It howled across the hilltops, rattling shutters and making the pine trees groan. The ranch hands finished their supper and headed to the bunkhouse, while Maggie and Addie cleared the dishes. "Does it always blow like this?" Maggie asked. Addie nodded solemnly. "Papa says the wind's just the land breathing." When Addie was in bed, Maggie stepped onto the porch. The night stretched wide and restless. The stars shimmered above, scattered like spilled salt. Elias stood by the rail, smoking quietly. The faint glow of his pipe flared and dimmed with each breath. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "You're settling in better than I expected. Is that your way of saying you thought I'd run?" He smiled faintly. "Most do. The plains aren't kind to those who come unprepared." "I didn't have much left to lose," she said softly. "Maybe that's why I'm not afraid." The wind caught her words, carrying them out into the dark. For a moment, all she heard was the steady creak of the porch boards. Elias turned, studying her face in the moonlight. "I was told your sister was the one coming. Maggie's eyes dropped to the railing. So was I. He waited. My stepmother thought it would be amusing. She continued, to send the one no one wanted, the plain one, the quiet one. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. I came because I was tired of being a shadow in someone else's house, she said. If this place sends me back, at least it'll be for who I really am. When she looked up, Elias's expression had softened. Copper Valley doesn't send back the ones who earn their place. Their eyes met, the air between them heavy with something neither dared name. Then, quietly, he said, "Good night, Miss Whitmore. Good night, Mr. Monroe." Inside her room, Maggie sat at the small desk and began to write in a small notebook she'd kept hidden in her satchel. Her handwriting was neat but trembling slightly. Day 12 in Copper Valley. The wind never rests. It seeps into everything, the house, the clothes, even the bones. And yet, somehow, I feel more at peace here than anywhere I've ever lived. Mr. Monroe is difficult to read, but his kindness is there, quiet and solid, like the land itself. Addie has already claimed my heart. I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I no longer fear it. She set the pen down, folded the page, and blew out the lamp. The next morning came with frost on the windows. Maggie woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of laughter downstairs. When she descended, Addie was twirling in the kitchen, her braids flying. "Papa says we're going to town today. You're coming to town," Maggie asked, surprised. Elias looked up from the stove. "Need supplies, and folks might as well meet the woman staying under my roof." "Will they mind?" He gave a wry smile. "In Copper Valley, folks will talk no matter what. Better they talk with their own eyes open." As they hitched the wagon, Maggie glanced back at the house. It stood strong against the endless wind, sunlight glinting off its windows. For all its roughness, it already felt like the first place that had ever belonged to her. As the wagon rolled toward the small cluster of buildings that made up Copper Valley's main street, she felt a mixture of nerves and something close to excitement. The road stretched out before them, dusty and golden under the morning light. Addie leaned against her arm, humming softly. Elias held the reins with easy confidence. Maggie looked out over the plains and thought, not for the first time, that perhaps the cruelest joke life had ever played was the one that led her exactly where she needed to be. The town of Copper Valley was a humble string of wooden buildings pressed close against the endless prairie. A general store, a blacksmith's, a small church, and a saloon that always seemed to breathe life even on the quietest mornings. As the wagon rolled down the main street, Maggie sat with her hands folded in her lap, trying to ignore the way heads turned and whispers followed them. Addie waved to nearly everyone they passed. "That's Mr. Higgins. He makes the best peppermint sticks. Oh, and there's Mrs. Duval. She bakes pies for the church fair." Maggie smiled and waved politely, though she could feel the eyes of the townsfolk linger on her longer than comfort allowed. It was the way they looked at all newcomers, curious, cautious, measuring. Elias stopped the wagon in front of the general store. "Won't be long," he said, stepping down to tie the horses. Inside, the air smelled of flour, leather, and sawdust. Shelves that lined the walls, stocked with everything from canned peaches to bolts of fabric. A man with a gray beard looked up from behind the counter. "Mornin', Elias. And who's this?" "This is Miss Whitmore," Elias said simply. "She's staying on at the ranch." The storekeeper's brows rose slightly, but he nodded. Welcome to Copper Valley. Ma'am, you'll find the wind here never stops, but the folks mostly mind their manners. Mostly, Maggie asked, smiling. The man chuckled. You'll see. While Elias discussed supplies, Maggie wandered toward a small section of books and sewing goods. A young woman nearby, perhaps her age but dressed more fashionably, glanced at her. You're the lady from the Monroe Ranch, yes. They say you came all the way from St. Louis. I did. The woman tilted her head, studying her. Brave thing, that. Some folks couldn't last a week out here. Maggie smiled. I suppose I'll find out. Before she could reply. Addie tugged at her hand, holding up a length of blue ribbon. Papa says I can pick something pretty for you. Maggie bent down, touched by the gesture. You think this one suits me? Addie nodded solemnly. It's the color of the sky before it rains. Elias glanced over from the counter, watching them, his expression unreadable. Then he paid for the supplies and said, Come on, girls. Clouds are building fast. By the time they reached the ranch, the wind had turned sharp. The horizon shimmered with an odd, golden haze. Elias's face tightened. That's not dust, he said quietly. Maggie followed his gaze. Far to the south, a thin line of smoke rose into the sky. What is it? Fire, he said. Looks like it started near the dry grasslands. Addie clutched Maggie's sleeve. Will it come here? Elias's jaw set. If the wind shifts, yes. We'll need to be ready. The rest of the afternoon moved like a dream. The ranch hands worked to clear brush, filling barrels and troughs with water. Maggie joined them, carrying buckets until her arms ached. Elias didn't stop her. He simply watched her work beside the men without complaint, hair falling loose around her face, eyes determined. By dusk, the sky had turned copper red. The fire was still miles away, but the smell of smoke already drifted across the plains. Inside the house, Maggie gathered the few things that mattered, Addie's school books, Elias's family photograph, the Bible on the shelf. Addie helped. Quiet but brave. When the first embers fell with the wind, glowing like fireflies, Maggie stepped outside and found Elias standing by the fence line. The horizon behind him glowed orange, the fire moving faster than anyone expected. He turned to her. We may have to drive the cattle north. Can you manage Addie? Yes, she said. Good. If the wind shifts again, you head for the creek bed. Stay low. She looked at him, the firelight flickering in his gray eyes. And you? I'll stay until the last horse is out. No, she said firmly. You can't fight fire alone. He hesitated. There was no time to argue, yet her tone left no room for refusal. Then you do exactly what I say. I can promise that much. The night exploded into motion. Men shouted, cattle bellowed, the wind roared like a beast. The fire raced across the dry grass, devouring everything in its path. Maggie and Addie led the horses to the creek, choking on smoke. Addie coughed, eyes wide with fear. Papa. Where's Papa? He's coming, Maggie said, though her voice trembled. She pressed the girl's face into her skirt. Don't look. Flames licked the horizon, somewhere through the smoke. She heard Elias shouting orders. The sound was swallowed by the wind. Without thinking, Maggie ran toward it. She found him near the corral, struggling to free a trapped horse whose reins had caught on a broken post. The animal screamed and kicked, wild with terror. Elias, she cried. Get back, he shouted, but she didn't. Together they pulled at the reins until they snapped free. The horse bolted, nearly knocking them down. Then a gust of wind sent sparks swirling around them. The barn roof caught with a deafening crack. Elias grabbed Maggie's arm. Run. They stumbled through smoke toward the creek. The world was all orange and black, fire and shadow. Maggie could barely breathe. Her lungs burned. Her legs felt heavy, but she kept moving. When they reached the creek, Addie was there, crying but safe. Maggie pushed the girl into Elias's arms, then collapsed to her knees, coughing. Elias knelt beside her, his hands gripping her shoulders. "You're hurt." "I'm fine." She wheezed. "We got them out." He looked at her, something fierce and unguarded in his eyes. "You saved my ranch, my men, my daughter." Maggie met his gaze through the smoke. "No, we saved each other." For a moment, neither spoke. The fire raged behind them, lighting the night like a sunrise in reverse. But inside that circle of ruin, something new had taken root. Respect. Yes, but something warmer, deeper. By dawn, the flames had died. Half the pasture was blackened, the barn half gone, yet the house still stood, scorched but whole. The men moved silently through the ashes, tending to the injured animals. Maggie worked beside them until her hands shook. When at last she returned to the house, Elias was waiting on the porch, hat in hand. "You should rest. So should you." He gave a weary smile. "You don't listen very well. Do you not when there's work to do?" He looked at her for a long moment. "You remind me of her," he said quietly. Maggie froze. "Your wife." He nodded. She had that same look-fire in her eyes when everyone else saw the end of things. Maggie lowered her gaze. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "Don't be. I think she'd have liked you." For a while they stood in silence, the wind whispering across the burnt field. Addie's laughter drifted faintly from the creek, light and unbroken. When Maggie finally went inside, she paused at the doorway, glancing back at him. He was still standing there, shoulders squared against the dawn, watching over the land as if to promise it would rise again. And somewhere deep inside, Maggie felt that the same promise now lived quietly in her own heart. The fire had changed everything. Weeks later, the smell of smoke still lingered faintly in the air. Mixed with the earthy scent of rain-soaked soil, the plains, once scorched black, had begun to heal. New shoots of green pushed stubbornly through the ash. So, too, had the Monroe Ranch. With the help of neighbors and ranch hands, the barn was rebuilt plank by plank. Maggie worked alongside them, mending torn harnesses, baking bread for the workers, soothing burns and scrapes with her careful hands. At first, the men had teased her gently, calling her the Lady Doctor or Miss St. Louis, but soon their tone shifted to genuine respect. When Maggie spoke, people listened. Elias saw it all in quiet astonishment. Every morning he found her already awake, sleeves rolled, tending to Addie or carrying pails to the barn. She had the kind of strength that didn't demand notice, it simply existed, like sunlight. One afternoon, while she hung clean linens in the yard, he approached, a letter in his hand. "Post came in from town," he said. Her fingers froze on the clothespin. For me, he nodded, offering it. The envelope bore the elegant handwriting she knew too well, her stepmother's. She took it with a trembling hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias hesitated. "Bad news. It's from the life I left behind," she said softly. "That usually means trouble." He gave a quiet nod and walked away, leaving her with the letter. Maggie turned the paper over, her pulse quickening. For a long moment, she couldn't bring herself to open it. Then, slowly, she tore it along the seal. My dearest Margaret, word has reached St. Louis that you are now settled as the wife, or near enough to that rancher, Mr. Monroe. Imagine my delight in knowing you found a place where plainness is a virtue. You'll be glad to know your sister Clarissa is engaged to a banker of great standing, a match made possible, in part, by your absence. Maggie's eyes stung, but she kept reading. Your father would have wanted what's best for you, though I can't say this life among dirt and cattle suits a whit more. Still, should you ever wish to return, we might find some charitable position for you in the city, perhaps a companion to your aunt. Until then, do remember who you are. Margaret, a Whitmore does not belong in the dust. The letter ended with no kindness, only the faint scent of rose perfume clinging to the page. Maggie folded it carefully, set it aside, and stood there beneath the wide blue sky, the wind tugging at her hair. For a long time she said nothing. Then she whispered, "No, I don't belong there any more." Later that evening, she found Elias in the barn repairing a saddle. Addie slept upstairs, her curls splayed across the pillow. "Mr. Monroe," Maggie said softly. He looked up. "Elias," he corrected gently. She hesitated, then nodded. "Elias, I received a letter today, from my stepmother." He put down the awl. "Bad news. Not exactly. More like a reminder of what I was never meant to be." He waited quietly. "She says I don't belong in the dust." Maggie's voice trembled with a mix of hurt and defiance, that I was foolish to come here. And yet she looked around the barn, the warm lamplight glinting off polished wood, the soft sound of horses breathing. This is the first place I've ever felt truly myself. Elias's gaze lingered on her face, shadowed with emotion. "She's wrong," he said simply. "The dust is where life begins, where it grows back after fire. You've done more good here in a few months than most people do in a lifetime." Maggie's throat tightened. "You really believe that I've seen it," he said. Silence filled the barn, gentle and full. Somewhere, a horse shifted, the faint jingle of its bridle echoing like distant music. Maggie smiled faintly. "When I first came here, I thought I'd been exiled. Now I think maybe I was delivered." Elias looked away for a moment, his voice low. "My wife used to say the Lord doesn't send us what we want. He sends us what we need." Maggie met his eyes. "And what do you need?" "Elias." He hesitated, then gave a small, almost broken smile. "I'm still figuring that out." The next few days passed quietly. The rhythm of the ranch returned to sunrise chores, long rides along the fence line, evenings on the porch with Addie curled in Maggie's lap as she read aloud. But one night, the peace broke. A rider came tearing down the lane, dust rising behind him. He dismounted at the gate, shouting for Elias. "There's trouble up north," the man cried. "A herd's gotten loose near the canyon. Some of it's yours." Elias grabbed his hat. "I'll go. I'll come with you," Maggie said. He turned sharply. "No, it's dangerous." "I'm not asking," she said, voice steady. He opened his mouth to protest, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It was the same look she'd had during the fire, unyielding. "All right," he said quietly. "Stay close." They rode out beneath the moon, hooves drumming the ground like thunder. The air smelled of rain and sage. When they reached the canyon ridge, the scene below was chaos, cattle scattered, men shouting, the night alive with noise. Maggie held the lantern while Elias and the others worked to drive the herd away from the edge. She shouted warnings, her heart pounding. Then a spooked steer bolted toward her. Elias. He swung around, grabbing the reins, pulling the animal back just in time. The lantern fell, the flame sputtering out. When the danger passed, they stood there in the dark, breathing hard. Elias reached for her hand. "You shouldn't have been that close." She laughed shakily. "You shouldn't have been faster." He looked at her, his grip tightening slightly. Maggie. The sound of her name on his lips felt like a confession. She swallowed. "Yes." He hesitated, the moment trembling between them, then released her hand. "We should head back. Addie will worry." Neither spoke on the ride home, but when they reached the porch, Elias helped her down from the saddle, his hand lingering just a heartbeat too long. Maggie turned to him. "You're a good man. Elias Monroe?" He shook his head. "No, just a man trying not to lose what little good he has left." "You haven't lost it," she said softly. "You just stopped believing it was there." Their eyes met, the quiet night wrapping around them like a held breath. Then Addie's small voice broke the stillness from the doorway. Papa Miss Maggie Elias stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Go on inside," he said gently. Maggie nodded, her heart pounding as she followed Addie into the house. Later, as she tucked the girl into bed, Addie yawned and whispered, "Papa smiles more when you're here." Maggie brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Does he?" Addie nodded sleepily. "He says the wind sounds softer lately. I think it's because you talked to it." Maggie smiled, her heart swelling with a strange, aching warmth. Maybe so. When Addie drifted to sleep, Maggie stepped to the window. Outside, the prairie shimmered under moonlight, vast and silver. She thought of the letter still folded in her drawer, the one that said she didn't belong in the dust. But here, in the quiet hum of the ranch, she finally understood the dust was where life began again. And perhaps, just perhaps, so did love. The summer sun had come early to Copper Valley, turning the prairie grass a deep gold. Days began before dawn, filled with the hum of cicadas and the creak of saddle leather. Maggie found herself busier than ever teaching Addie her letters in the cool mornings, helping Elias mend fences by afternoon, then cooking supper while the sky burned orange and violet. It had become a rhythm she loved. There was comfort in the sameness, in the sound of Addie's laughter drifting through the open windows, in the quiet strength of Elias's footsteps outside the porch. But that peace would not last. One late morning, as Maggie kneaded dough at the kitchen table, she heard the distant clatter of hooves. The rhythm was different, too fast, too sharp. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch just as a carriage rolled into the yard. A tall man in a tailored gray coat climbed down, brushing the dust from his sleeves. The sun flashed on a gold pocket watch at his vest. Behind him, the coachman stood stiffly, eyes averted. "Maggie Whitmore," the stranger said, voice clipped and polished. "You're difficult to find." She frowned, the familiarity of his tone scraping something old and unpleasant in her memory. "Do I know you? Sir Clarissa's husband," he said smoothly. "Thomas Braxton. We met once, briefly, before your departure." Maggie's stomach tightened. "Mr. Braxton," she said quietly, "what brings you all this way?" He glanced around the yard with thinly veiled disdain. "A matter of family concern." I've come at your stepmother's request." Elias appeared from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Everything all right?" Miss Whitmore Thomas turned, eyeing Elias as one might a workhorse. "You must be Mr. Monroe." "Yes, I can see why she stayed. Sturdy surroundings." Elias's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained calm. "And you are Thomas Braxton, Margaret's brother-in-law." Maggie's face flushed. "You said you came on family business. Say what you need to and be gone." Braxton smiled thinly. "Still the stubborn one. Your stepmother regrets the circumstances under which you left. She wishes to make amends. She asks that you return to St. Louis. Clarissa is expecting, and the household requires a woman of steady character." Elias folded his arms. "Sounds like they miss having someone to take advantage of." Braxton ignored him. "You've made your point by running off. Surely the novelty of this rustic life has worn thin." Maggie's voice was low but firm. "There is no novelty here, only work and peace. Two things that house never offered me." Braxton's mouth tightened. "You would throw away your name, your bloodline. For this?" He gestured toward the fields. "You think this is your place?" "Yes," she said simply. He studied her for a moment, eyes cold. "Then you're a greater fool than I thought." Elias stepped forward. "That's enough." Braxton met his gaze, then gave a short, humorless laugh. "Protective, are we? How gallant. I suppose every man needs a cause." Before Elias could reply, Maggie spoke sharply. "Mr. Braxton, you'll take your carriage and leave this property now." Something in her tone, calm, absolute, made even the wind still for a moment. Braxton's jaw worked. Then he tipped his hat mockingly. "Very well. But when you tire of dirt and duty, remember where you came from." He climbed into the carriage. As it rattled away, Elias stood silent beside her. After a long moment, Maggie exhaled. "I should have expected that." "He had no right to speak to you like that," Elias said, his voice tight. She turned to him, her eyes steady. "He spoke for every person who ever thought I wasn't enough, and for once, it didn't matter." Elias's expression softened. "You handled him better than I would have." Maggie smiled faintly. "I've had years of practice." That night, the sky turned violet over the plains. Addie had fallen asleep early, exhausted from chasing fireflies. Maggie sat on the porch steps, watching the last light fade, when Elias came out carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed her one. "You did right. Stand your ground." She sipped quietly. "I used to think leaving St. Louis was running away. Now I think it was the first time I ran towards something." Elias looked out at the horizon. "You know, when you first came here, I thought it was a mistake. I thought you'd hate this place, the wind, the silence. I didn't understand why you stayed. And now," he paused, "now I can't imagine the ranch without you." Her breath caught. The words hung between them, heavy with all that was unspoken. "Elias," she said softly, "I never meant to intrude. If my being here ever causes talk or trouble, stop." He turned toward her, his voice rougher now. "You've done nothing but bring light back into this house. Addie smiles again because of you. And—" He hesitated, searching for words. "So do I." The night grew still. The soft rush of the wind through the grass sounded like the sea. Maggie set her cup down, her heart pounding. "You shouldn't say things you don't mean. I mean every word." She met his gaze, and for the first time, neither looked away. His hand brushed hers on the porch rail, just the lightest touch, but it sent a warmth through her that no summer night could match. "I don't know what happens next," he said quietly. "I'm still trying to make peace with the past." "Then let's start there," she whispered. "One day at a time." He nodded slowly, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. One day at a time. For a long while they sat in silence, watching the stars bloom across the sky. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, its cry lonely yet alive. When Maggie finally went inside, she lingered at Addie's door, watching the little girl sleep. The child's hand was curled around the small wooden horse Elias had carved for her, its paint worn smooth from love. Maggie felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it wasn't sorrow anymore. It was something gentler, like gratitude. Downstairs, she returned to the kitchen and unfolded the letter Braxton had brought her stepmother's own handwriting on the back. It read only, "Remember who you are." Maggie stared at the words for a long moment, then tore the paper cleanly in half. She whispered to the empty room, for the first time, "I do." Outside, the wind picked up, sweeping through the open fields, carrying the scent of wild sage and rain. The house creaked softly, old but unbroken. And in that moment, Maggie knew she wasn't just surviving in Copper Valley anymore, she was living. Summer in Copper Valley was fierce and beautiful. The fields swayed with tall, golden grass, and the river glittered like molten glass under the sun. The Monroe Ranch thrived again, cattle strong, fences mended, men singing as they worked. Yet beneath the bright days, a quiet tension began to stir, like thunder beneath a blue sky. It started with whispers. When Maggie went into town for supplies, she noticed them first, the sidelong glances, the sudden silence when she entered a room. At the general store, Mrs. Duval greeted her politely, but with a curious tilt of the head. "You're making quite the name for yourself, Miss Whitmore," she said. Maggie smiled cautiously. "I hope it's a good one." "Oh, people do talk," the woman replied, arranging tins on a shelf. "They say you've taken over the Monroe house, that you've got the widower wrapped around your finger." The words hit like a slap. "That's untrue," Maggie said quietly. Mrs. Duval shrugged. "You know how towns are. They love a story more than the truth." That evening, Maggie rode home with her basket of supplies balanced in her lap. The wind had turned sharp, carrying the scent of coming rain. She tried to shake off the unease, but by the time she reached the ranch, it clung to her like dust. Elias was waiting by the gate. "You're late," he said gently. There were whispers. She murmured. He frowned. "What kind? The kind that stain, even when they're false?" He studied her face, then took the basket from her hands. "People talk because they have little else to do. Let them. You've done nothing wrong." She wanted to believe that, but later, as she tucked Addie into bed, the words still echoed in her mind. "They say you've taken over the Monroe house." After Addie fell asleep, Maggie went out to the porch. The rain had started, light and steady, tapping against the roof. She sat on the steps, staring out into the dark. Elias joined her, his presence quiet and grounding. "You're troubled," he said softly. "I didn't come here to cause talk," she said. "All I ever wanted was peace." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Peace rarely comes without a price. She turned to him, the lamplight catching the edge of her face. "Does it bother you? What they say?" He hesitated. It used to. I cared too much what people thought. After my wife passed, every whisper felt like judgment. But now he looked at her, his eyes steady. I care more about what I see in front of me, her breath caught, and what do you see? A woman who saved my ranch, my child, and maybe even me. The rain grew heavier, filling the silence between them. You don't owe me gratitude, she said. He shook his head. This isn't gratitude, Maggie. It's something else. She met his gaze, the truth between them trembling like a flame in the wind. But before either could speak further, thunder cracked across the valley. Elias stood, his voice rough. You should get inside. Storm's coming hard. Maggie rose, but for a heartbeat longer, neither moved. Then she nodded. Good night. Elias, good night. Maggie. The next day, the storm passed, but the tension did not. By noon, a rider came from town with a message. He handed it to Maggie, tipping his hat awkwardly. From the church committee, Ma'am, Reverend Porter's wife asked me to deliver it. Maggie unfolded the note. Her face paled as she read Miss Whitmore. It would be best if you refrain from attending Sunday service until matters concerning your arrangement at the Monroe Ranch are clarified. She folded the paper slowly, her hands trembling. Elias found her in the yard, staring at the letter. What is it? She handed it to him without a word. He read it once, then again, his expression hardening. They dare to send this, Elias, she began. Please, he tore the note in two. You've done nothing wrong, and I won't have them treat you like you have. It's not worth a fight, she said softly. You've lived here all your life. They'll turn on you too if you defend me. Let them, he said. His voice was low, almost dangerous. I'm tired of bowing to gossip. But Maggie shook her head. No. If I'm the cause, then I'll fix it. I'll go to town tomorrow and speak to the Reverend myself. Elias stared at her. You don't have to justify your place here. I'm not doing it for them, she said. I'm doing it for Addie. The next morning, she rode into town alone. The church stood on a small hill, its white steeple cutting into the sky. She knocked on the parsonage door, and Reverend Porter's wife answered, her eyes widening slightly. Mrs. Porter, Maggie said calmly. I came to clear the air. There's nothing improper between Mr. Monroe and me. I'm here to help raise his daughter and run the ranch. That's all. The woman's lips pressed tight. Appearances matter, Miss Whitmore. People have seen you walk in the fields together at dusk, sitting on his porch at night. Working, Maggie said, talking, living decent lives, Mrs. Porter sighed. I believe you, but not everyone will. Then let them live with their lies, Maggie said, her voice steady now. I've lived with worse. She turned and left before the woman could answer. That evening, when she returned, Elias was waiting by the porch again. You shouldn't have gone alone. I had to, she said. It's settled now, at least for me. He exhaled slowly. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known. Maybe just more tired of being weak, she replied. Addie came running out then, clutching something in her hands. Papa, Miss Maggie, look. She held up a small, wildflower crown, the petals uneven but bright. I made it for you. Maggie knelt, smiling. It's beautiful, Addie. Papa says flowers grow better after storms, Addie said proudly. Maggie glanced up at Elias. Their eyes met, and she saw the truth there, not just admiration, but something deeper, warmer, waiting to be spoken. As the sun dipped low behind the hills, Elias said quietly, Maybe she's right. Maybe some things only bloom after they've weathered the wind. Maggie touched the flower crown gently. Then I think we're both still growing. For the first time in years, she laughed a sound light and free. Elias smiled too, and though neither said another word, the quiet between them was no longer filled with doubt, but with promise. That night, as the stars scattered across the dark sky, Maggie wrote in her journal by lamplight, "The valley whispers still, but I no longer fear its voice. For I've learned that truth doesn't need to shout, it endures, quiet and unbroken, like the wind across these plains, and downstairs, through the stillness of the night." Elias sat awake by the dying fire, the torn church letter beside him. He watched the flames fade, his thoughts turning toward the woman upstairs, the woman who had walked into his life like a storm and left peace in her wake. The days after the gossip died were calm again, filled with long stretches of work and sunlight. The fields swayed gold beneath the wind, and the sound of hammers echoed from the barn as Elias and the men finished a new roof before the rains. Maggie moved easily through her days teaching Addie her reading, tending the garden, mending clothes. The rhythm of the ranch had become her pulse, but peace, she had learned, was never permanent. It was borrowed, fragile as the morning mist. One afternoon, as thunderclouds gathered far to the west, Elias rode out with 2 ranch hands to check the fence line. Maggie watched them disappear across the plain, her heart carrying an old worry she'd never spoken aloud, the quiet dread that something might take him away before she could ever tell him how she felt. That evening, the storm arrived. The sky turned a deep violet, and wind swept through the valley, bending the grass flat. Addie clung to Maggie's arm as the first crack of thunder rolled over the hills. "Papa will be all right, won't he?" the girl whispered. Maggie smiled, though her hands were trembling. "Your papa's stronger than any storm, sweetheart." Lightning flashed, rain poured down in sheets, drumming on the roof, turning the yard into rivers of mud. Maggie lit the oil lamps and closed the shutters. The house groaned under the wind. She tried to stay calm for Addie's sake, but every gust made her heart leap. Hours passed. Still no sign of Elias. When the storm eased toward midnight, Maggie wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The world was a blur of silver rain and black sky. The lantern she held flickered wildly in the wind. She called out once, her voice nearly lost to the rain. Elias no answer, only the low moan of wind through the cottonwoods. Then, faintly, she heard it a horse's whinny, uneven and desperate. She ran toward the gate, skirts heavy with water, heart pounding. A figure appeared through the dark. A rider slumped in the saddle. "Elias," she cried. He was soaked, hat lost, face streaked with mud. His horse stumbled to a halt, trembling. Maggie reached up as he slid from the saddle, nearly collapsing into her arms. "I'm all right," he gasped, his voice hoarse. Fence line gave out Tom's taking care of the herd. "Come inside," she said firmly, half dragging him toward the porch. Inside. The light from the fire cast a warm glow. Maggie helped him out of his wet coat, her fingers shaking. He was shivering, his hands ice cold. She guided him to a chair by the hearth. "You're burning up," she murmured. "I'm fine," he said, trying to wave her off, but his voice wavered. "Don't you dare tell me that," she said, sharper than she meant to. She fetched a blanket, draping it over his shoulders. "You could have been killed out there." He looked up at her, eyes soft with exhaustion. "You worry too much, because you give me reason to." The words escaped before she could stop them. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of fire and the rhythm of rain on the windows. Elias's gaze held hers. "You were afraid for me." "Of course I was," she said quietly. "You mattered to us, to Addie, to me." He reached out, catching her hand. His skin was rough and warm beneath hers. "Maggie." Her breath caught. He hesitated, searching her face as though afraid of what might come next. "When you first arrived, I thought you were a burden I hadn't asked for. Then you became the best thing that's happened to this place since Addie was born." Maggie's heart thudded painfully. "Elias, don't... No, let me finish." His voice was steady now. "You've brought laughter back into this house. Hope. I don't know what I'd do without you." The firelight flickered between them, soft and golden. Maggie wanted to speak, but her voice wouldn't come. At last she said, almost in a whisper, "Then don't try to..." Something shifted in his eyes, fear and longing all tangled together. He reached up, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face. "Maggie, I can't promise more than what I am. I've loved before, and it broke me. I don't know if I can risk that again." She smiled sadly. "You don't have to promise forever, Elias, just honesty, and a chance to see where this road leads." He stared at her for a long moment, then leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently to hers. "You're braver than I'll ever be." She shook her head. "No. Just tired of waiting for permission to live." When he finally kissed her, it was not rushed or hungry. It was slow, certain, filled with all the words they hadn't said. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside the world had gone still. Afterward, they sat by the fire, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. Addie, asleep upstairs, was safe. The house was warm again. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," Elias murmured. "None of us do," she said softly. "But tonight, we're here, and that's enough." He smiled faintly. Enough. Then, the rain eased to a soft drizzle. Somewhere beyond the hills, a wolf howled a lonely, haunting sound that somehow didn't feel sad. Maggie lifted her head, listening. "When I first came here," she said, "I thought this land would break me. The wind, the silence, it all felt so big. But now I think it just made room for something better." Elias tightened his arm around her. "What's that us?" she whispered. He kissed her hair. "Then I suppose the storm was worth it." They sat there until dawn painted the windows pale gold. When Elias finally rose to check the herd, Maggie stood in the doorway, watching him. He turned once, caught her gaze, and smiled a small, quiet smile that said everything words couldn't. As the sun climbed over the valley, the world felt new again. The storm had taken the night, but left behind something greater, a beginning neither of them had dared to hope for. Upstairs, Addie stirred and called out softly. Papa, Miss Maggie looked up, her heart full. "We're here, sweetheart," she said, and for the first time she realized that the words weren't just comfort for a child, they were a truth for all of them. They were here, together, and that, she thought, was the truest peace she had ever known. By the time autumn came, the valley had changed color. The fields glowed with amber light, and the aspens along the river shimmered like coins when the wind passed through. The ranch was quiet again, peaceful, strong. Maggie rose each morning to the scent of wood smoke and the sound of Addie's laughter drifting down from the loft. Elias had begun humming while he worked, a habit she hadn't heard from him before. The sound filled the house like sunlight. There was still much to do before winter. Hay to stack, fences to mend, and the last calves to brand. Maggie worked beside Elias and the men, her sleeves rolled, her braid tucked under her bonnet. When the others teased her for working harder than any of them, she only smiled and said, "Idle hands don't warm in winter." At night, after Addie had gone to bed, she and Elias would sit by the fire, their chairs drawn close. Sometimes they talked of weather, of ranch business, of memories long buried. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. Silence between them had become its own kind of comfort. One evening, after a long day of harvest work, Elias poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to her. "You've made this place feel alive again," he said, "like it used to." She looked at him, her eyes soft. Maybe it never stopped being alive. "Elias, it was just waiting." He smiled faintly. Maybe so. Outside, the wind stirred through the dry grass. Maggie listened to it, feeling the ache of something gentle and new inside her, a longing that was no longer sharp, but full, like a quiet river after rain. Days passed in a slow, golden rhythm. Then, one crisp morning, as the first frost silvered the pasture, a rider appeared on the road, a young man carrying a leather satchel. Elias met him at the gate. "Mail courier." "Yes, sir," the man said. "Letter from the Copper Valley Post." Elias took the envelope and frowned. It was addressed to Maggie in careful handwriting. He handed it to her later that afternoon, his expression curious. She turned it over and saw the seal a government mark. Her stomach tightened. "It's from St. Louis," she said quietly. Elias's brow furrowed. "Do you want me to?" "No," she said. "I'll read it myself." She waited until evening, after Addie was asleep. Before opening it, the paper crackled softly. "Miss Margaret Whitmore, we are writing to inform you that Charlotte Whitmore has passed away, and that her estate is in settlement. As her stepdaughter, you are named in the will for a portion of inheritance. Should you wish to claim it, please reply within 30 days of receipt." Maggie stared at the letter for a long time, her heart strangely calm. The name Charlotte Whitmore no longer had the power to twist her chest. Elias found her by the fire, the letter folded neatly in her lap. "Bad news?" "Not bad," she said softly. "Just the end of something." He knelt beside her chair. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not. I knew the day would come." She looked into the flames. "I thought I'd feel anger or sadness, but all I feel is peace." Elias took the letter from her hands, glancing over it. "You could go back," he said quietly. "Claim what's yours." "What's mine is here," she said, meeting his eyes. "That house in St. Louis never wanted me. This one does." He reached for her hand, holding it gently. "I wouldn't stop you if you wanted to go." She smiled. "You don't have to stop me. I've already stayed." For a while, neither spoke. The firelight painted his face in gold and shadow. Then, slowly, Elias said, "You know, Addie asked me yesterday if she could call you Mama." Maggie's breath caught. "What did you tell her?" "I told her she should ask you herself." Her eyes shone with tears she didn't bother to hide. "I'd be honored," she whispered. When Addie asked the next morning, Maggie knelt and opened her arms. The child flew into them, laughing. "You're my mama now, aren't you?" Maggie held her close, her voice breaking softly. "If you'll have me, sweetheart, I'd like nothing more." Elias watched from the doorway, his throat tightening. The sight of them together, Maggie's arms around Addie, sunlight catching in both their hair, felt like a prayer answered quietly by the land itself. That evening, he took Maggie for a walk down to the creek. The water ran low now, its surface smooth and glassy. The last light of sunset painted everything in amber and rose. "I used to come here with her," he said, his voice low. "My wife. We built this ranch together, dreamed it up from nothing. After she died, I stopped coming. I thought the place had lost its meaning." Maggie stood beside him, the hem of her dress brushing the grass, and now he turned to her, eyes steady. "Now I think meaning isn't something we lose. It just changes shape." The air between them felt heavy with truth. Elias took her hands. "I'm not a man for grand words, Maggie, but I've lost enough to know when I've been given a second chance. You're that chance." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "Elias," he silenced her with a small smile, "I'm not asking for your past. I'm asking if you'll let me share your future." The wind rustled through the grass, whispering like a benediction. Maggie's voice was quiet but sure. "Yes," she said, "for as long as we both are given." He drew her into his arms. There, in the fading light of the valley, they stood, two souls who had crossed fire, shame and sorrow to find one another at last. When they returned to the house, Addie was waiting on the porch steps, her small hands clutching the wooden horse Elias had carved for her. "Did you find any stars yet?" she asked. Elias looked down at her, then up at Maggie, and smiled. "I think we just did." Later that night, as the moon rose over the plains, Maggie wrote one final letter to St. Louis. Her pen moved with calm certainty. To the executors of Charlotte Whitmore's estate, please distribute my portion of the inheritance to the orphanage on St. Charles Street. I have no claim to what never belonged to my heart. My home is in Copper Valley, among the dust and the wind, and the people who have taught me that love is the only fortune worth keeping. She sealed the letter and set it by the door, ready for the next post. Outside, the wind whispered through the golden fields, carrying the scent of harvest and rain. Maggie listened from the doorway, her heart full. This, she thought, was what peace truly felt like, not the silence of being unseen, but the stillness of being known. And in that stillness, love had found her at last. By November, frost kissed the fields each morning. The valley had gone quiet under a pale sky, the air sharp and clean. Smoke rose from the chimneys, and the Monroe Ranch glowed with the kind of warmth that came from more than just firewood. Maggie stood on the porch one morning, wrapped in a wool shawl, watching Addie chase snowflakes across the yard. Elias was at the barn, hammering the final boards into a new stall. His breath steamed in the cold air, his movements sure and steady. It was only a week until their wedding. Sometimes Maggie still caught herself pausing, hardly able to believe it. After all the loneliness, the cruelty, the years of being unseen love had found her here, on a patch of wind-swept land at the edge of nowhere. The townsfolk had changed toward her, too, since the harvest festival, when Elias had walked into town with her hand in his. Heads had turned, but not with the same judgment as before. Whispers had softened into smiles. People had seen the way Addie clung to her, The way Elias's eyes lit when Maggie spoke. Even Reverend Porter's wife had come by last week with a basket of bread and a quiet apology. Maggie had accepted it with grace, not pride. The past no longer stung the way it once did. That afternoon, Maggie sat at the kitchen table mending a ribbon for her wedding bonnet. Addie climbed onto the chair beside her. "Papa says snow means good luck for a wedding," Addie said. Maggie smiled. "Then I suppose we'll have more luck than we can hold." "Are you nervous?" Addie asked, studying her face. "A little," Maggie admitted, "but only because it feels like something too good to be true." Addie tilted her head. "It's not too good. You made it true." Maggie laughed softly, touched by the child's wisdom. "You might be right about that." When Elias came in from the cold, shaking snow from his hat, Maggie looked up. His eyes met hers and lingered a moment longer than necessary. The warmth between them made the whole room glow. "I finished the new stall," he said. "We'll have room for the spring foals." "Always thinking ahead," Maggie teased gently. He smiled. "Old habit. But I like thinking about what's next now." That evening, they shared supper with Addie by lamplight, simple food, hearty and warm. Afterward, while Addie dozed by the fire, Elias and Maggie stood in the doorway, watching the snow fall outside. "It's strange," he said quietly. "A year ago, I thought my life was over. I couldn't see past the grief. And now—" He turned to her, voice rough with emotion. "Now I can't imagine it without you." Maggie reached for his hand. "Sometimes life gives us back what we thought we'd lost, just in a different form." He smiled, that rare, unguarded smile that always melted her. "I suppose that's true." They stood in silence, their hands still joined, the snow falling soft and endless. When the wedding day finally came, the world outside was wrapped in white. The small chapel in Copper Valley stood glowing with lanterns, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. Neighbors had gathered, ranchers, shopkeepers, families from miles around. Elias waited at the front of the room, tall and solemn in his dark suit. He turned as Maggie entered, and for a moment, the noise in the room faded into nothing. She wore a simple ivory gown borrowed from a neighbor, the lace slightly frayed but beautiful all the same. Her hair was pinned with a small sprig of winter holly. In her hands, she carried a bundle of wildflowers Addie had gathered the day before. When she reached the front, Elias took her hands gently. His thumb brushed the scar on her wrist, the one she'd gotten years ago, sewing by candlelight in that cold house in St. Louis. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. The Reverend cleared his throat, smiling. "I've known many unions made of comfort and convenience," he said, "but few as built upon courage as this one." As he spoke the vows, Maggie's eyes never left Elias's. "When he said I do," his voice was steady, deep, certain. When it was her turn, she whispered, "I do." But the words felt larger than the chapel, like they were a promise to every version of herself she had ever been. Addie clapped her hands when the Reverend announced them man and wife. The congregation laughed softly, and Elias bent to kiss his new bride. It was a kiss filled not with urgency, but with peace, with gratitude, with the quiet joy of two hearts that had finally found home. Outside, the snow fell heavier now, thick and soft, covering the earth in white silence. As they stepped from the chapel, the guests threw handfuls of grain, a symbol of prosperity. Elias looked at her, his breath fogging in the cold. "You're not cold, are you?" Maggie shook her head. Not with you here. Addie ran ahead, her small boots crunching in the snow. Come on, Mama, hurry. Maggie laughed, turning to Elias. You hear that? He grinned. Best word I've heard in years. They walked hand in hand down the snowy path, the church bells echoing behind them. Back at the ranch, neighbors filled the house for a small gathering. The air smelled of stew and baked apples. Laughter rose and mingled with the crackle of the hearth. Maggie watched Elias move among the guests, his face easy, his eyes always finding hers in the crowd. Later, when the last of the visitors had gone and Addie had fallen asleep upstairs, they stood together outside beneath the stars. The snow glittered under the moonlight, and the night was still enough to hear the faint cry of an owl in the distance. Elias drew her close, his voice low. So, Mrs. Monroe, how does it feel? She smiled against his chest, like I've finally come home. He tilted her chin up and kissed her again, slow and sure. Then, home, you'll stay. For a long while they stood like that, surrounded by the vast quiet of the Wyoming night. The wind whispered through the trees, gentle and kind. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, as if to bless what it had witnessed. And in that stillness, under the stars and the snow, the Monroe Ranch became not just a place of work and survival, but a living testament to everything they had endured and everything they had become. Their story, once born of shame and doubt, had found its ending not in grandeur, but in grace. And for Maggie Whitmore, now Maggie Monroe, that was more than enough. By the time the first crocuses broke through the thawing earth, Maggie had already begun preparing the garden beds behind the house. The air smelled of damp soil and pine, and the river nearby sang with melted snow. After the long, quiet winter, everything seemed alive again. She straightened, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, and smiled as she saw Addie running across the yard, hair streaming behind her like a golden ribbon. Mama Addie called, waving a folded piece of paper. Look what Papa brought from town. Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and took the letter. It was a notice from the Copper Valley School Committee. The small, one-room schoolhouse had lost its teacher over the winter, and they were asking if Maggie might consider taking the position through the spring term. She looked up just as Elias walked through the gate, his hat tilted back, that half-smile she loved tugging at his lips. Well, he said, nodding at the letter, I thought you'd like to know before anyone else. Her eyes sparkled. You knew they'd ask, he shrugged. Word travels fast around here. Folks trust you. Maggie held the paper against her chest, a quiet joy swelling inside her. I'd love to teach again, she said softly. It feels right. Elias stepped closer. It does. You got a gift for bringing life to things, Maggie, whether it's a garden or a child's mind. She blushed faintly, still not used to praise spoken so openly. Well, I suppose I'll need chalk, slates, and patience. Patience, he said with a grin. You've already proven you have plenty of. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Maggie sat by the window, writing a letter of acceptance. Addie leaned on her arm, drawing tiny horses on scrap paper. Elias worked at the table, sketching plans for a new barn addition. The lamplight flickered, warm and golden, painting the room with peace. This feels like the beginning of something good, Maggie said softly. Elias looked up. That's because it is. The weeks that followed were full and lively. Maggie began teaching a dozen children from the valley, including Addie, in a small room near the church. She filled it with laughter and lessons about more than just letters and sums. She taught them about kindness, about the strength that comes from standing tall even when life bends you low. On the ranch, calves were born, and the air filled with the scent of fresh hay. Maggie and Elias worked side by side through it all, fixing fences, planting early crops, riding out together to check the far pasture. Their marriage had settled into a rhythm that was neither rushed nor routine. It was built on quiet gestures, a mug of coffee left steaming for him in the morning, a shawl draped over her shoulders when he thought she wasn't looking, the way their hands always found each other when they passed by the hearth. One morning in late April, Elias rode out early to deliver cattle contracts. Maggie stayed behind, finishing lessons for the day. When the children had gone, she lingered in the schoolroom alone. She traced a finger across the blackboard, still faint with chalk dust, and thought of the girl she had once been, the one sent away from St. Louis in shame, believing herself unwanted. Now, as she looked out at the valley, she realized something profound. The world hadn't changed. She had. That evening, Elias returned home just as the light turned soft and gold. He found Maggie on the porch, rocking slowly with Addie curled in her lap, half asleep. "Long day, teacher?" he asked gently. She smiled without opening her eyes. "A good one." The children read aloud for the first time today. I swear the sound of it could have lit up the room. He leaned against the post, watching her. "You look at peace." "I am," she said simply. "For the first time, I'm not waiting for life to begin. I'm living it." Elias came closer, his hand brushing her shoulder. "I don't tell you enough, but this ranch, this family, it's better because of you." Maggie met his gaze, her voice quiet but sure. "It's better because of us." Addie stirred, murmuring something in her sleep. Maggie lifted her and carried her inside, tucking her beneath the quilt. When she returned, Elias was still on the porch, looking out at the stars. She stood beside him, the night cool and clear, the scent of pine sharp in the air. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Every day, and I thank God for it." They stood there together, listening to the steady rhythm of the night, the wind through the grass, the distant low of cattle, the creak of the old porch boards beneath their feet. After a long silence, Elias spoke again. "You remember the day you arrived, standing at the gate, rain in your hair, eyes full of fire?" Maggie smiled. "I remember thinking I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. And now I think it was the first right step I ever took." He chuckled softly. "I reckon fate has a strange way of finding us." She reached for his hand, interlacing her fingers with his. "Maybe it's not fate," she said. "Maybe it's just love stubborn enough to keep walking even when the road turns rough." He squeezed her hand gently. "Either way, I'm glad it led you here." The stars shimmered above them like scattered embers. Maggie leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice soft. "Do you think the land ever tires of changing?" Elias thought for a moment. "No," he said. "It just keeps renewing itself, same as we do." Maggie smiled, her heart full. "Then I suppose this is our spring, too." He turned to her, his eyes warm. "Ours, and Addie's, and whatever comes after." In the weeks that followed, the valley burst fully into bloom. Wildflowers carpeted the hills, and the scent of lilac drifted through open windows. Life moved forward quietly, beautifully. One Sunday afternoon, Maggie stood at the edge of the pasture, watching Elias and Addie race their horses along the ridge. Addie's laughter echoed across the open land, bright and fearless. Elias rode beside her, his hat low, his voice calling encouragement. Maggie pressed a hand to her heart, overwhelmed by the simple perfection of the moment, the sound of family, of belonging, of everything she had once dreamed but never dared to believe she could have. As the sun began to set, Elias lifted Addie down from her saddle and waved to Maggie to join them. She walked through the tall grass, the golden light wrapping around her like a blessing. When she reached them, Elias took her hand. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how lucky we are," she said softly, "and how grateful I am that life can bloom again, even after the hardest winter." He smiled, brushing his thumb along her cheek. "Then here's to the spring, Mrs. Monroe." She laughed quietly. "To the spring, Mr. Monroe." And as the sun slipped behind the distant hills, painting the valley in soft hues of gold and rose, Maggie felt the truth settle deep within her. Home wasn't a place at all. It was a person. It was this Elias, Addie, the land that had once seemed cruel but now held every promise of peace. And so, beneath the endless sky of Copper Valley, their story born of pain, tempered by courage, and crowned with love, found its forever. In the end, Maggie's story isn't just about love, it's about becoming enough in a world that tried to convince her she wasn't. We've all felt that way at some point, haven't we? Too old, too plain, too different. But the truth, the quiet, steady truth is that worth isn't something given to us by others. It's something we choose to claim for ourselves. Through Maggie, we see that healing doesn't come from revenge, but from compassion. That real strength isn't loud or proud, it's found in small acts of kindness, in staying when life gets hard, in believing again when the heart has every reason not to. And maybe that's what we're all still learning, that even after loss, after betrayal, there can be a second bloom. Love, like the prairie after rain, always finds a way to grow back. So, if you've ever been made to feel less than you are, remember Maggie Whitmore. Remember how she turned dust into home and sorrow into grace. Thank you for watching and sharing this story with us. If it touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own journey, please like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts. Together, let's keep these stories alive, the ones that whisper across time that love, in all its quiet courage, is still the greatest frontier.